So I'm continuing my game where people can submit a text to me and I tell them three errors in the text. The next submission is from Teo Ajantaival. Probably said that wrong. It's his own article called Minimalist Extended Very Repugnant Conclusions Are the Least Repugnant. And I have not read it yet, but I did glance through it. And I have an initial criticism, but it's not of the article or the author. It is of the upvoters and readers. So it definitely doesn't count as an error for the game purposes, but I thought I would write it down anyways. So what I noticed basically, at a glance, is that this is a high effort article. It is part 4 in a series. It is a 22-minute read. It has sections and subsections and acknowledgments, references. There are both notes and bibliographies and appendixes. See, bibliography stuff, acknowledgments, appendices, notes. Like there are diagrams, there's formatting, there are block quotes somewhere, I think. Yeah, there's a block quote. So you see all these superficial signs of effort. There's a list with numbers. All of those are good signs that the author put some effort in. They're not a guarantee that it's high quality or anything, but at a glance, probably this is reasonably high effort and that it has a decent chance of being decent quality. If you're trying to skim things and look for which ones might be high quality to read, this has many of the superficial signs that it might be high quality and would be worth a look. And it's 3 weeks old, and it has 65 karma, which actually I believe is 22 upvoters approximately. It could be like 20 upvoters and 2 downvoters. It's hard to know because the amount of karma per vote is variable on this website, which is actually confusing, and I think it's a bad idea. I think they actually like having inflated totals because a lot of people will see 65 and think that there are like 65 active users on the site who upvoted it, when at most it had 22 people upvoting it, not counting the OP. OP being original poster, the author. There are also a bunch of tags, which is again, tagging your own article is a sign of effort. There are also a lot of links in the article, again, a sign of effort. So, approximately 22 upvoters, 0 comments on something that appears to be high effort and to probably make some sort of important claim. Like, I assume that if it is correct, it's saying something that matters, and that would matter to some of those people upvoting it. And they probably wouldn't be upvoting it if they figured that the thesis doesn't matter and is irrelevant. So I think the thing going on is basically people feel like they've discharged their duty to engage with it by upvoting it. They've supported it, they've done their part, even though they haven't actually engaged. And that is that they've left the job of actually, thinking about what it says and writing some sort of comment to someone else. And so we have 22 people discharging that duty and leaving it to someone else, and no someone else. No one did that. And so their strategy of delegating by upvoting does not work. And it fairly predictably doesn't work. It's not a good strategy. It's not reasonable. So any individual upvoter, maybe they did the right thing for their situation, their context. I have no idea. I'm not trying to comment on specific individuals, but the aggregate effect of the community norm, where this kind of thing is reasonably common, is bad. The aggregate effect is there is no one here who's taking responsibility for seeing that a 65 karma article gets any kind of feedback whatsoever. No one feels like it's their job to respond to arguments, even upvoted arguments, or even high effort arguments, or even arguments that appear high effort, or whatever criteria you want to use. Even arguments from posters who have been around for a few years and have 477 karma and have university degrees and credentials and It actually reminds me, so if you have like an emergency in a crowd, it can be better to point at a single person and say, you call 911, than to say someone call 911 because everyone in the crowd will think someone else will do it. If you just ask the crowd in general to do something, sometimes no one does anything. Whereas you pick a single person at random, you can have a better chance that someone does something. I think there's something similar going on with these upvotes. If it was a tiny forum with like 3 users, they wouldn't all think, oh, well, someone else is going to do it because there aren't very many people. Similarly, sometimes it can be easier if you have a car crash and you're on the side of the road. You might have a better chance of someone stopping for you if it's a very empty road, not busy at all. And so someone sees you and they're like, oh my God, there might not be another car coming by for 20 minutes. I have to stop. Whereas if it's a very busy road, maybe no one stops. Because everyone thinks the next guy can stop. It's not their problem. So I think some of that is going on here. And there's a sort of in aggregate problem of the attitudes of all these upvoters. And I think specifically the upvote tool helps them feel like they engaged, they contributed, they supported it, they took an action. It gives them an action to take other than real engagement that helps them feel better, feel that they can move on. So it's actually problematic to give them that option at all. I'm not saying there are no upsides or it's bad overall, but there's a downside to giving someone a superficial way to take an action so that they don't feel like I ignored it. And this is not an isolated incident. Here is another example. This one doesn't have a bunch of upvoters, but this is a contest submission, so this is not unsolicited. This is a solicited post. EA wanted people to write things like this. They asked for submissions, and this guy wrote a 31-minute read with a bunch of subsections, again, lots of signs of effort and quality. And he got no engagement. He didn't get upvotes, so that's a difference, but no engagement. The one comment is himself. He edited his post, and then he kept a record of the original version in the top comment, or the single comment. So it has zero feedback, despite being a solicited, high-effort article. If you do that to people, they're probably not going to try again. It's really problematic to get people to make this kind of effort and then just ignore them. You're asking for something, but then you're treating it like you don't value it and giving no feedback on how could he write something next time that would get feedback or that would be valued. Like, what is one way that this is not useful to EA? So that explains why it's not getting feedback, upvotes, etc. Like, there's no way for him to do better next time. There are no hints about what to change. So he's getting a very cold reaction, plus no clues about how to not get a cold reaction next time. And then this one, it's less cold because of the upvotes, but even when it gets more attention, you still get no comments. So in some ways, that's worse. You're like, even if I get a bunch of attention, I'll still get no feedback, maybe. That's really discouraging for someone who wants to write things here. Like, I thought that some of the lack of feedback on some of my articles is because people disagree with me and dislike me and don't want to hear what I'm saying. But this is a very high upvote to downvote ratio, I'm pretty sure. I don't know exactly how many upvotes per person you get. Like, I don't know if there are people who are like, a single person can give 20 karma from one vote. So maybe it's not as fully upvoted as I think, but I thought it was fairly typical that people give like 1 to 3 points per vote, in which case this is almost all upvotes. So even with a positive reaction, saying things that aren't offending and alienating people, and getting a good amount of upvotes and getting some level of attention, there's still no actual feedback, no actual engagement. So it's like, well, then how the heck do you get engagement? Even if you're like popular enough that you should get some engagement, you still don't. So how do you win this system? Do you just have to have, do you have to be friends with the right people? Do you have to have rapport with the right people? Do people have to know your name? Is it that kind of social hierarchy? Do you have to write things that are easy to engage with, like not too smart and clever and advanced and stuff? Is the attitude basically that this is a casual form, and if you want serious stuff, you have to go join a think tank or join academia? Because one of the reasons people come here is that there are a lot of problems with, like, be an employee at a think tank or be a professor and work in academia. There are a lot of downsides to those paths, and so there's some demand for serious discussion, serious thinking, etc., on the internet, available to people without who work some sort of different job, or who just don't like academia or don't know of any think tanks that they actually respect or something like that. And so if the attitude here is basically don't say anything very serious, it's not for that. That should be like really clearly labeled so people don't waste their time trying. And it's not. EA is soliciting that kind of stuff on purpose and then treating it poorly. And I haven't done a big survey, like maybe if we survey more posts, this isn't as representative as I suspect it is. I don't know. That would be a bunch of work, and I don't think it would be appreciated. I don't think that it will get me rewards in the community that I value if I do that work. I think the community itself ought to look into that and ought to care more that people seeing this are going to think this is a bad place to post essays. Like me just seeing this one thing, I might be like, oh, I don't want to bother with this community. Because even 65 upvotes, 65 karma does not get you any feedback at all on what appears to be very high effort. My own forum is small, but I make sure it's not like that. If someone wants to come and write some sort of serious essay that looked anything like this, that was criticizing any of my ideas, and no one else engaged with it, then I would definitely say something. I would not want that to go ignored. EA gets more high effort submissions, but they have a lot more people to read and engage in stuff. And so the scaling should maybe be like equivalent between high quality submissions and high quality available readers and feedback givers and stuff like that. There's no particular reason that as the community gets bigger, you should have a mismatch between too many high quality submissions to too few readers and feedback givers. So that is my complaint. So now I'm going to actually look at this and try to find 3 errors in it. Because the author himself asked me to, and he wasn't even sure if he was allowed to self-submit his own article. Can we submit our own writing? And because there are a lot of places that are hostile to that, such as Reddit. But that is something I've never been hostile to, and I really dislike the anti-self-promotion norms that exist in some places. So yes, of course your own writing is fine. Um, my view on debate is it doesn't matter who wrote something, like, for most purposes. It matters whether the ideas are true or reasonable or whatever. So in a debate, I think people should use a lot of literature they did not write, which is actually abnormal. People often think that when you're debating, you have to use your own words. And I think the majority in a serious debate in general should be literature references, not your own words. But of course, your own words work too. Like if you've written something in the past that is high effort and polished, if you've added to the literature in some way, then yes, use that too. The reason for literature is you don't want debates to be full of ad hoc comments that are not polished and not edited. Like you shouldn't be rewriting ideas that already were published with high effort and editing, and you're just like rewriting them quickly with lower effort, lower editing, worse polish, so they're not going to be explained as well. Like you want to use the highest quality version of something, which usually is going to already exist and be written down. Like you can give the source you learned it from instead of rewriting and paraphrasing. And there's a lot of value adds you can do. You can summarize, you can highlight key parts. You can give brief bridging comments that explain the relevance, that connect some more generic idea to the specific topic being debated. You can do a little bit of customization work. You can specify some exclusions or additions or changes. But actually just rewriting the ideas themselves in general is way, way overrated in debates. I think a lot of why people do it is that they are not really familiar with the literature and they don't want to be, and it's easier to not go and read the literature on their own side, in which case their debates are not very serious and not really oriented at finding the truth. If you won't read your own side's literature, then you shouldn't claim that your own side is correct. You don't know that. Like you have to read your own side's literature and review the other side's literature before you can make any kind of reasonable claim to have reached a good conclusion. So if you can't use your own literature in a debate because you don't know enough about it and it's too much work for you to go read things and find things, then you don't really know what you're talking about. And it's fine if you want to have a casual debate where you're exploring ideas and trying to write your own arguments in order to learn things in practice. But that is different than actually trying to seriously find the truth, like an expert who's trying to be objective about the field. So people do a lot of the practicing kind of thing where they don't really know the literature, but they like trying to write their own debates and maybe they learn something by that. And it's not necessarily a bad activity, but it is often not labeled to differentiate it from actually trying to organize the known ideas in the field and figure out what's true. Anyway, all of that was very tangential. I'm now going to look at this article. Okay, so this is about axiology, which is the study of the nature of value and valuation and the kinds of things that are valuable. So it sounds somewhat related to moral philosophy. And he's talking about minimalist axiologies that mean we're trying to minimize something, which is a misleading term, because when I hear minimalist axiology, I think you're going to have a very simple one with like a very simple rule. A minimal amount of content in the axiology. Whereas it actually says the less of something, the better. So we're values of minimizing certain traits of the world. So I would want to call that a minimizing axiology. I think that would be clearer. Not a big deal. And this reminds me of, I have an article that I think is relevant. So this is about maximizing the number of squirrels as a moral premise, but minimizing the number of squirrels would reach almost identical conclusions. It doesn't particularly matter. And the basic point of the article is that if instead of squirrels it were bison or something else, and if instead of maximizing it was minimizing, as long as it's a very, very strong goal, the steps don't change much. You have to be rational and support science and get wealthy and get control over the universe and do space travel and colonize the galaxy. And then finally, at the end, when you have this like multi-galaxy civilization that's extremely powerful, then you fill a bunch of planets with squirrels in like galaxies you aren't using. Or exterminate all the squirrels and police the galaxy to make sure that none ever come back if you're trying to minimize them. And one of the points is that the foundations of morality don't matter as much as people think. Because you can have many, many different foundations and get very similar points, like that capitalism matters. There are many, many different moral goals where you need a bunch of wealth and science and rationality and technology and civilization spanning galaxies and so on. So those things are approximately independent of moral foundations. Things like book burning being bad have a substantial amount of independence from what you actually want to minimize or maximize or what you value. There are very wide ranges of values where being pro-science and anti-book burning is going to help with those values. Okay, I get it, I think. Yeah, I don't like offsetting views where you just add up a score, and so you can have some really bad stuff and then some other good stuff offsets it, and you get to ignore it. The same basic problem comes up in epistemology. So this is talking about values and morality, but I have run into this problem more in epistemology, which is my own specialty that I've spent more time on. And the basic idea in epistemology that's very widespread is you look at the evidence and arguments in favor of an idea and you add up how good they are. And then you look at the evidence and the arguments against that idea and you add up how bad they are and you subtract that. And then you get an overall score. And so an idea can have some sort of huge glaring flaw, but because it has many, many good things that add a lot of points, it gets an overall high score. And once you have a high score, if a critic comes along and points out something bad, you can say, oh yes, I've listened very closely and you have a great point, and I will subtract like 500 points due to that. However, it still has a like 5 million point lead, so I still believe it. But thanks for helping. And you get this problem where basically criticism gets ignored due to the offsetting. Because instead of having to address the criticism, having to give a rebuttal to it, you can just offset it. Instead of engaging with the criticism and thinking about what it means and how to solve the problem, you can just figure out what do I get positive points from and go get a bunch more of those. And so there's something really bad there. Okay, so this is a point of possible agreement, because he's anti-offsetting and I'm anti-offsetting as well. Okay, so it makes total sense to me that you could reach repugnant conclusions by using offsetting for morality. That does not surprise me at all. I have a more broad disagreement with this kind of thinking, which is it's not explanatory. It's not looking at causes like why is the welfare high or low? What could be done to improve it? What is causing this situation? How could it be changed? Like, we're just comparing these sort of arbitrary hypotheticals instead of considering how can we improve the real world and get to good outcomes and how would these things come about. More broadly, I don't agree with utilitarianism or think it's a good way of thinking. And I also do not agree with deontology. There's like this consequentialism versus deontology debate, and I think both sides are wrong. It's weird, and clearly consequences and principles both matter, and we should have a system that's capable of using both of them instead of picking one or the other. Utilitarianism is consequence oriented because it's like look at the consequences and see how much utility they have. So there's a lack of framing on this to relate it to anything that I think is important, but it is fourth in a series, so can't really blame the author for that. There may or may not be some framing to relate it to standard perspectives and like why I should care in earlier parts. Although the author did link me to this one in particular instead of the first one in the series, I'm not sure why. I might just go and look at the first one and point out some errors in that because this one relies on it as like a premise or prerequisite, I think. So I think that would be fair. If you're trying to build on something and I find an error in the thing you're building on, that seems like a relevant error. So I'll keep reading this some more, but I might try that. But this is overly specialized with a bunch of premises I don't agree with. So they're getting into details that I don't think are relevant or important because they're building on stuff where I have prior disagreements. This is weird. Like, they have some definition of what a leading welfarist axiology is, and then there are also other welfarist axiologies. And it's not a single leading one, there's like multiple leading ones. Or do they mean whichever one is currently leading can never have a quality? By the way, it's not clear to me at all that this particular thing was very repugnant. Like, if you believe in offsetting, like on that premise, I don't, why is it repugnant? It's like, let me give an analogy. Some people think it is very repugnant to have $1 billion debt. They don't like big debts. However, if you have like $100 billion of assets on the offsetting theory of money, and I think the offsetting theory is basically correct for money, then having $1 billion debt is okay. You're 99 billion in the positive overall, and it's fine. Apple is a reasonable example here. They had like hundreds of billions of dollars of spare cash, and nevertheless took out loans for tens of billions of dollars. It was partly for tax reasons because they didn't. Anyway, doesn't matter that much why. But some of the money was overseas, and there were tax issues, and blah blah blah. And so they just borrowed against it instead of moving it or doing whatever would be inconvenient for them. They just took on huge amounts of debt at low interest rate, secured by huge amounts of money that they actually did have. It was just inconvenient to access. And I think for money, offsetting is a pretty good model. If it's just money against money. And so there are some people who think having debt is repugnant. Like, there are people who say don't have a credit card. It doesn't matter if you have enough money to pay it off every week or every month. Just don't get a credit card anyways. That is like an actual thing that people advocate. It's not super popular, but it's not unheard of either. They just see the debt as repugnant and they don't think that being able to pay it off every time offsets that. So, my point is, if the offsetting model is correct, then it should work like money, where offsetting actually works. In which case, if you think that, then this scenario should not be repugnant, just like having some credit card debt that you pay off every month is not repugnant. $1,000 of credit card debt is fully offset by $1,100 in a savings account that you can pay it off with. And so if that model really worked for this stuff, if you actually believe in offsetting, you should think that these arbitrarily many negative lives are just like having some credit card debt. And if you have many, many, many bank accounts with a dollar in them, if you have billions and billions of $1 bank accounts, that's just as good as one bank account with billions of dollars in it. First of all, it doesn't matter that it is spread out in many, many different bank accounts. I mean, like, there's a bit of overhead, administration overhead. Like, there's a practical hassle to it, but that's not the point here. So, first of all, it doesn't really matter that the money is spread out in many accounts instead of in one account. And second of all, having enough money in the bank accounts really does offset having debt. So, if you believe in offsetting, you should not find it very repugnant. If you find it very repugnant, that means you don't believe in offsetting. So, this is not a criticism of the article that I'm reading, it's a criticism of his opponent. Perhaps it's an omission from the article if he doesn't notice this point, or something. Like potentially I'm adding something that he may have missed, although, maybe he says it in one of the first three articles or later in this article. I have no idea. But I should probably write something down about that. Funny. They're claiming there are no plausible views other than these offsetting views with these problems. Well, I do not agree with that. Yeah, it also does not apply to debate-based views, where you try to reach decisive conclusions through arguments, and if something is refuted by criticism, then you reject it. The Popperian worldview. I don't know what the XVRC is. VRC is the very repugnant conclusion. I know what that is. Oh, extended VRC. Illustrate shortly at the beginning of section 2. Okay, so he's talking about it before saying what it is. Yeah, he's talking about it here. And he says what it is later. So I think that's an error. I don't know if it's important. I think it's reasonably important that this stuff is out of order and it's confusing. He did give a link to later, though, so I'm going to let it go. But things that make it harder to read could be contributing to the lack of feedback. This is actually extremely misleading. Um, because it denies the or ignores or something the distinction between quantity differences and quality differences. There's a well-known concept of a quantitative distinction and a qualitative distinction. And I think what they mean here is quantity always substitutes for quantity in different denominations. Like one big one can substitute for many little ones, or vice versa. So what you're substituting for is not a qualitative difference, but for different denominations of quantity. And so using the word quality for that to mean like large quantities or small quantities is problematic when you cannot substitute quantity for a qualitative distinction. That's what a qualitative distinction means. A difference in quality means a difference in kind, type, category. So I would really advise not using the word quality here. I don't know if that's standard or if the author did that. Yep, this makes sense. I get what they're talking about. I don't see why any of this matters. It seems to all be based on wrong premises. But what I'm trying to find right now is actual errors by the author. I think part of why it's hard so far is he's primarily summarizing literature rather than making claims. And so I've commented on some errors in the literature that he's summarizing, but that's different than errors by the author. Like, I have not spotted that he inaccurately summarized the literature, which would be hard to do without checking the literature. Sometimes you can tell someone's probably summarizing the literature wrong because what they say doesn't make any sense. But this stuff, so far, seems fairly coherent, and I think I get basically what he's trying to say. So it doesn't have a bunch of signs of summarizing the literature incorrectly. I'm not seeing like red flags for that. By the way, I disagree with this kind of collectivism. I don't think you can offset what happens to my life with what happens to someone else's life. I think that the mentality here, the underlying mentality, is that there are conflicts of interest, that you can't just have win-win solutions, whereas I think that you can have and should aim for win-win solutions and social harmony, following the classical liberal view. And so I find this kind of thing where they're looking at sacrificing all these people for the benefit of others as basically related to Marxist class warfare, where you get some groups winning and others losing. And I think that that's unnecessary and bad. Like they're talking about all this stuff as an arbitrary presupposition. What if there were these lives with these utilities instead of considering like why should anyone suffer? Is there any conflict that is causing that, or is it just happening due to mistakes? Maybe they really did mean quality, and it was meant to deal with qualitatively different stuff. In which case, the example of like a bunch of minor pains versus a big pain, where it's the same category, was misleading. I'm now wondering if there's a confusion or a mistake. So I'm finding like some level of chronic ambiguity here that seems confusing. But there are a bunch of links, and possibly if I clicked on them, I would figure it out. But just reading the article, I'm struggling to figure out what he actually means. I'm still unclear on what the extended part means. I guess it just means some of the variant scenarios that seemed to me like they were making the same basic point. So I didn't really differentiate. What is lexicality? Okay, it means some are superior. Why does it mean that? Okay, strange terminology. Don't understand what it has to do with the regular meaning of the word. But he's just saying that there are qualitative differences. I think that's lexicality between goods means there are qualitative differences. Which I agree with. I think there are qualitative differences. You can't just combine it all into a amount of utility. There are a bunch of different goods in different dimensions with no conversions. And I don't think decision making can or should or needs to rely on converting everything into a single score for each option and then choosing whatever has the highest score. I think there are better methods that don't have to convert dimensions, which is good because you can't. And I've written about that, like my multi-factor math. And I posted this on EA recently and got essentially no substantive discussion. There are like a dozen comments on it, but yeah, basically no substantive discussion. But the basic point of this article is that there are qualitative differences between things, and you can't just combine scores to make decisions or evaluate things. You have to leave things in different dimensions. Right. Yes, exactly. I question that. Yes, and these issues are actually related to breakpoints in general. Do you have graphs with nice gradual slopes and continuity and all that, or are there breakpoints on the graphs of how much you value particular quantities or how good it is to have particular amounts of particular quantities? Do you get smooth graphs for that or breakpoints? And if you get breakpoints, then you can have qualitative differences between quantities of the same thing because being on different sides of a breakpoint is qualitatively different. And one of the issues is that breakpoints and interchangeability between different types of goods are often contextual. And so a lot of these attempts at some sort of universal analysis are going to run into problems because how good something is not just an absolute fact that's universal, it is instead contextual. I don't know how you make a table like this on EA with red highlights on some of the fields, or with multiple header rows. I used tables recently. I don't think I found like any useful help, and I managed to make them work at all, but I didn't know how to put two header rows. I don't know if those are really header rows or if it's just coloring added. Oh, this is ironic. The concept of a strong point in favor is basically using an offsetting view. But the sentence is arguing against offsetting views, admittedly in a different context, but there's still an irony to it. They're using an offsetting view of epistemology to make a statement against offsetting views in axiology. And I don't think they recognize that. And it's not a logical necessity of what they said. They could mean it a different way, but I read it as using an offsetting view. When people talk about strong points, generally they have in mind an offsetting view. Because if you're not using an offsetting view of epistemology, then the concept of a strong point loses some of its meaning. Like the point of calling the point strong rather than just saying it's a point is to say it's worth a lot of offsettingness, basically. Whereas if it's in its own dimension, you're just saying I have a point in this dimension, and trying to quantify it is misleading and problematic because the quantities don't compare across dimensions. I don't know why the text just sort of teleported around or whatever it just did. Don't know what happened there, but anyway. I converted it in Ulysses. It looks like that worked correctly. I just used paste from HTML. Then I copied it as Markdown, and then I brought it over here into Cot Editor. And it looks good. Well, okay, it's a little weird because there's a star. There's like stars around. It's getting double italicized on the link stuff. Like we see where it says previous, we have stars inside and outside the brackets. That is strange. I don't know if that's correct. And then there's also stars around the entire sentence. So it seems like we have a bunch of redundant italicizing. And what we should have is just the entire sentence as italic. So I'm going to go through and just delete all of them, except the ones on the very edges. I wish that EA had quoting features where you could like highlight text and then quote it. I'll show you an example from my forum, which is Discourse. It is standard open source software. Anyway, it doesn't matter what the text is, but you can highlight, and then you can click quote, and you get a quote, and it preserves formatting. You don't have to worry about copy pasting, losing italics or something. So it is nice to be able to quote with formatting without any manual overhead hassles, trying to use text editors that'll help do the work for you, etc. So that is something that I would recommend EA fix. There are several ways that EA's forum is worse than Discourse. I think overall they would be better off switching to Discourse and writing a few plugins for it instead of rolling their own software. The biggest difference, though, is that it doesn't do nested comments. It does standard forum threads linear, chronological. Maybe EA really, really doesn't want that. I think that overall, the linear format is better if you have to pick one. I think they could. I think a better hybrid system could be invented. But if you're just going to pick one or the other, I favor linear. It definitely has downsides though. So I can understand EA not wanting to choose it. There's probably some standard forum software that does nesting that EA could use that would have other features that EA does not have. I also don't know how hard it would be to add nesting to Discourse with a plugin. I assume that would be significantly easier than writing EA's forum software, the effort that took in the first place. Although the project to write that was started quite a while ago, so I don't know what the state of Discourse at the time was, or what the available open source alternatives to collaborate with were. Anyway, Wait, it wasn't even the full abstract. That's ridiculous. Wait, the text doesn't even match. Abstract, according to lexical views. Then here, lexical views in can. Like, what? Something's really wrong here. Okay, so error one is that the quantity and quality thing was confusing. Error two is that he actually uses offsetting in epistemology without realizing it, probably, while arguing against offsetting in axiology. And while there is significant overlap in the flaws between axiology offsetting and epistemology offsetting, they run into some of the same conceptual and fundamental issues. And then error three is the general lack of framing, the lack of engagement with other relevant literature, like acting as if political philosophy doesn't exist, not addressing concerns that a reader might have. It's very abstract, but it's also partly not. Because what they do is they come up with these abstract ideas, but then they use common sense intuitions they have, like that stuff is repugnant. Like, why is it repugnant? They don't argue that it is repugnant based on their abstract reasoning. They just have that intuition. So they're combining this very rationalist armchair philosophy reasoning stuff with just regular intuitions, and then they debate it in ways that I think are not productive. So I think there's something wrong with the field in general, and that it's doing things that are not really productive or useful, and that it's not really trying to think about how to organize society or concrete examples of any of the stuff that it's saying, how any of it would make sense. How are you going to actually get these scenarios? And so that raises questions like, why write this article engaging with this bad academic discipline? What's the point? Why focus on this over something else? Why is this useful? And then I commented that that wasn't really the type of error I wanted to point out, but I thought it was actually relevant and important here. And also, due to a lot of summary of literature that he does not agree with, there weren't enough targets for criticism, for regular criticism, because he wasn't expressing his own ideas or even ideas that he agrees with enough. He did not put forward much in the way of positive claims. Instead, it was mostly negative claims about stuff that I don't think is very important anyways. So, so I wrote about that, and then I also suggested that if he watches my video, then I said some other things, and probably some of what I said, criticizing the field or commenting on other things, would actually constitute some sort of relevant criticism or disagreement with him. There's probably something I commented on where I don't know what he believes, but he does, so he could recognize it as a relevant issue where I could make an error claim. So there might actually be some better points that he would find as more useful, better feedback, more what he wanted in my video somewhere. I just didn't know which ones they were. And that all seems pretty reasonable to me, so I think this is done. 2 hours and 10 minutes.